Web of Lies, Chapter 10, Southampton. Thomas and Diesel left London the next morning to tremendous fanfare. The cheering Londoners had no idea that the duo had devastated the station yard at Paddington and obliterated a goods shed in Victoria. If they had, they might not have been cheering quite as loudly. The rest of the journey was relatively peaceful. It was mostly through serene countrysides, accompanied by an ever-growing number of seagulls. Thomas couldn't help but feel that Edward was watching over them. But another thought occurred to him as they traversed these rails, and it filled him with dread just thinking of it. This was the very route his siblings had taken when they were reallocated all those years ago. How awful that was to think about, that they had spent their entire lives toiling away in the switchyards at Victoria and London Bridge, and then they were finally given the breath of fresh air that was the southern English countryside. They enjoyed their first good long run in years, joined by sea air and green groves and passing villages, only to be shut up in another, even more dismal shunting yard. The yard Thomas and Diesel were going to now. Thomas knew logically that going to this harbor was the way home, but as they got nearer and nearer and the green countryside receded in favor of cold concrete, Thomas could not help but feel that he was being trapped. Thomas had heard all about Southampton from other engines. He had good friends that had worked there, and they had made a point of emphasizing the scale to him, but he never truly understood it until he and Diesel arrived there. Shipping containers everywhere, walls and walls of them, with what seemed like hundreds of great gantry cranes to place them on the decks of the waiting supertankers. If Cranky the Crane had been here to see this, he would have come down with a serious case of crane arm envy. The docks were bustling with busy people, preparing the dizzying number of containers for departure. One was working rather nearby Thomas. He got her attention, and then he asked her the questions that had been on his mind for the entire journey. "Hey, excuse me," asked Thomas a little too excitedly. Is this the harbour where the E2s once worked? You know, the ones by Mr. Billington." The dock worker only scratched her head. "Do you mean those American ones? The USA tanks?" Thomas winced a little and thought of Rosie back home. He felt very upstaged. He tried to be polite. No, before them." "Oh, I see. Well, what were they like?" Thomas just sighed. That answered it right there. Like me, he would have said. But if she'd remembered those engines at all, she'd have recognized him right away. They really had been forgotten. "Excuse me for asking," the woman went on, "but are you done up in promotional colors, or are you the real Thomas the Tank Engine?" Thomas smiled at this, but he smiled sadly. "Yeah, it's me. Nice to meet you, ma'am. You want an autograph?" She did, coincidentally, for her and her 2 kids. She thanked him and called him really useful and then went to continue her work elsewhere in the massive port. "All right, we need to find the manager," and Thomas cursed himself, realizing, I should have asked that lady over there. It could have been her. If only I hadn't been so busy answering questions." "Don't bother finding anyone. There's no point," Diesel said plainly. Thomas just blinked, astounded. They had come all this way, and now Diesel had suddenly lost interest? He wondered if he'd heard right. "Speak for yourself. I want to go home." But Diesel just spluttered and cut him off. "This ship won't get you home, you fool." "Well, she will after I'm done talking to her. I can be quite convincing," and Thomas began to saunter boldly alongside the waiting vessel. But Diesel called him back. "The ship isn't going to Sodor, you imbecile." For a few moments, only the cold ocean around them could be heard. Thomas spoke softly and with some confusion. "What are you saying?" "Do you know why I was so insistent on sailing out of Southampton, Thomas?" Thomas had indeed been curious. There were other ports available to them. Britain was, after all, an island. "You told me this was the only route you knew." And then Thomas's thoughtful expression collapsed into one of frustration. "But I imagine that was a lie too, wasn't it?" "Yes," he said in a weaselly tone. But there is one thing I was honest about. I do have the network memorized. Every line in every region. I could have charted a course to any harbor we chose." "Then why this one?" the tank engine asked, still puzzled. Diesel met his gaze again, and confessed. "Because it is international." All the pieces fell into place. A week of deception began to make sense at last. Thomas was stunned. "You can't be serious. You want to leave the country." "Of course I'm serious. Look around, Thomas. All of England resents me. You've seen it firsthand. I have worked in all 6 regions. I have shunted yards as far north as Edinburgh, as far south as Plymouth. I have journeyed to every corner of Britain." "You really do get around," Thomas marveled for a second, and then chuckled. "You're even more well-traveled than Percy. He got passed all over England before I met him, and even he had less than a dozen owners." "Indeed. I have visited hundreds of yards." And for this next part, his voice almost broke. "And they have all rejected me, and passed me on to the next. Now there are no alternatives left. There is nothing left for me in the United Kingdom." At that moment, a nearby gantry crane roared to life and began rolling slowly toward them. It passed over them both, showering the 2 engines with small flakes of yellow paint and rust. It carried on until it reached a train of steel shipping containers behind them. Once it was done unloading those, Thomas was sure that Diesel was next on the manifest. He didn't bother asking how Diesel had managed to book passage. He put nothing past him at this point. And this triggered another thought. "Wait, so you're just going to leave me here?" "That is the plan. Yes." Thomas's angry panting subsided a little. He wanted to be cross, but he was too astounded by Diesel's sudden honesty. Now that he had gotten what he wanted out of the tank engine, he no longer had any reason to lie. There wasn't even a risk of Thomas telling all his secrets to the others. Diesel had no plans of going back to Sodor. This, strangely, was the first time Thomas had ever seen him speak honestly. And his response was not contempt or even disgust. It was pity. Diesel said no more. He simply waited for the great yellow crane to take him. He looked more relaxed than he had all trip. This had been his goal all along. The big metal behemoth ground its way along the rails until it stopped just above the Gronk. The long crossbeam with chains on all 4 corners slowly dangled toward the waiting diesel engine. His face grew peaceful and joyous, eyes closed in anticipation, as if he were being raptured. And then the crane stopped. Diesel opened a self-assured eye. "What's the hold-up?" It was then that the foreman of this particular dock marched up, rather urgently. "Frank, how many times do I need to tell you?" he shouted up to the crane operator. "We need to confirm the shipment before we pick anything up. Let me talk to the driver real quick." But of course, there was no driver. So Diesel spoke in his place. "It's all above board, sir, I assure you," said Diesel with the utmost confidence. But the foreman just stared right past him, like he wasn't even there. Like he hadn't said anything. "You two! Is this your engine? Do you have the paperwork?" Maxine and Marcel stammered nervously. Neither knew what to say. Diesel whispered snippily to them. "It's in my cab, damn it! Just grab it!" Marcel put a hand to their mouth. Something dawned on them. "Oh my, so that's what those were." And then they chuckled at an uncharacteristically high volume. Diesel was out of patience. "What's so funny?" Marcel just shrugged. "Sorry, Diesel. I couldn't give him the papers even if I wanted to. They must have been mixed in with the stack of posters. I think a little girl somewhere in London is the proud owner of a bill of lading with Thomas's signature on it." Diesel was speechless, and from the foreman's perspective, he might as well have been the whole time. "Well then, I guess this one's a no-go," and the foreman shook his head. "When are people gonna get their shit together? Lot of money to waste over some missing paperwork." And he boarded the ship to speak with the captain. In mere minutes, the great vessel was sailing away, fully loaded. "No!" cried Diesel, racked with panic. "You can't!" He wanted to chase after the ship, but he couldn't do such a thing without someone at the controls. So he just sat there and cursed the heavens, then the cranes, then the harbor master, and just about everything else in his vicinity. And then his fury devolved into misery, and he broke down in tears. "Right then," said Marcel, who was now beyond negotiation. "It's time to call the Fat Controller." And together, both driver and stoker hurried off to the foreman's office. Both engines were left alone by the dockside. It was a half-hour before Diesel could so much as find the will to speak again. Thomas addressed him at last. "So this whole thing was a ruse, from A to Z."
"Yes, you're correct."
"Huh." Thomas just ogled off into oblivion for a while, watching the waves. He was clearly struggling to follow the threads. Diesel rolled his eyes. It was taking everything in him not to just explain the whole thing outright. But he gave the tank engine time, if only so he could enjoy the silence. At last, Thomas's eyes grew wide. A bombshell had just dropped inside his smokebox. He turned to the Diesel, as mystified as he was infuriated. "You never really wanted the mail cars, did you?"
"No," he said lazily, and grinned down at his unwilling travel partner. "There were no government bonds on that train."
Thomas scoffed. "Ha! I knew you didn't know a thing about bonds."
"Oh no, I know where all the government bonds are. I also know what routes the Treasury trains take. But I've tried those schemes already. Too many drivers ended up in Her Majesty's prison service."
"My God," said Thomas, without much else to add. He had stopped a thief once. The man had stolen some trophies. At the time, Thomas had thought that was a big deal. At last, unprompted, Diesel broke down and explained the whole thing in full, a wicked grin growing upon his maw as he did so. Thomas buckled in. The Diesel needed a safety valve for monologues the same way steam engines needed them for steam.
"I knew I could never reach Southampton on my own. They would have crucified me the second I showed my face, regardless of the yard or the region. I needed a cover, somebody to distract them, and nobody's more eye-catching than you."
Thomas tried not to smile at the compliment. Context was all wrong for that.
"So I needed to draw you out, make you chase me. Percy's mail cars were the perfect bait. I knew you couldn't let your friend down. For whatever reason, he matters quite a lot to you."
"Yeah, but why take Percy's train? Why not take something that mattered to me?"
"Well, I thought about taking Annie and Clarabelle, but I wanted to emigrate, not die. So I decided against it."
Thomas smirked in agreement. Wise choice. Indeed, that would not have ended well. There would likely be a few more Gronk-shaped holes peppered throughout Britain if Diesel had gone through with it. Both engines returned to silence for a while. Then Thomas chuckled, and Diesel got curious as to why.
"Something funny?"
"It's just..." Thomas tapered off his laughter. "We sent Hero home. Hero. We put him on a ship, and we sent him to Japan. At great expense, mind you."
"As if the Fat Controller would ever do that for me,"
Diesel moped. "Well, he would have, if you were nicer." Thomas considered his words. "But then again, if you were nicer, you wouldn't need to run away in the first place, would you?" Diesel's lack of rebuttal was the greatest agreement he could muster. Thomas figured he ought to change the subject. Scanning the rows and rows of docksides that line the southern coast of England, he was struck by a question that had burned him on and off for years. He realized now that he was in the perfect place to ask it, with the perfect engine. "You said you worked in every yacht in England."
"Yes,"
Diesel confessed tiredly.
"Some more than once."
"So you must have worked in this one, then?"
"Of course."
He sounded irritated, as if he had just been asked to answer the same question twice. Because, for Diesel's deductive mind, he might as well have.
"You're curious about your siblings, aren't you?"
Thomas felt emotional whiplash. He had wanted to build up to that admission. "Yeah, I am. Last time I saw any of them was in the 10s. Diesel gazed down at Thomas thoughtfully. He was careful with his words, though, strangely, not because he was trying to deceive.
You are aware that they are no longer living, yes?
It was an impressively sensitive sentence. Thomas smiled a little. Yeah, that's why I'm asking. I figured you might have met them. Again, Diesel was not quick to respond. Thomas listened to the electric motors spinning inside his frames. He usually answered any question with no doubt and little hesitation. But now he seemed to be putting work in. And that, of course, was because Diesel was considering something he never had before. Other people's feelings. But his objectivity won out, of course.
Yes, I did. They looked terrible. They were so mired in filth they could have worn a color as bright as yours, and nobody would have known. A sorry sight.
He paused for a moment, and then added,
They were scared, too, presumably of their imminent demise. That's how they were, for the brief time I was here.
Diesel made a point of only looking down at Thomas's face after it had all been said. He had to remain impartial to the tank engine's feelings, which he'd never taken notice of till recently, if he was going to answer factually. When he looked up, he was surprised by Thomas's lack of misery. There was an undeniable sadness there, but nothing too striking. He had clearly assumed that this had been the fate of his family. I'm not surprised, he said resignedly. Truth be told, I didn't know them too well. I was still so young when I left Victoria. I was so mad at all of them. They wouldn't stand up for themselves, or me. They were content to be forgotten. I imagine they forgot me too. But then a hopeful thought struck the Blue Engine. Do you know if they ever heard about me? Maybe they heard about the books.
That I don't know,
the Diesel Engine said, with total neutrality. Thomas only sighed. I guess that's one mystery I'll never know the answer to, then. Diesel could not understand his sadness, but if nothing else, he was learning to recognize the symptoms. A two-tone horn sounded out from the yard entrance, and a deafening growl came into earshot. Thomas recognized the Diesel from volume alone.
Hello, Tommy!
Bear rumbled over the points with two huge low-loader flat trucks in tow. His deafening motor filled the whole city with sound, let alone the dockyard. The seagulls were startled from their perches and darted chaotically through the port in all directions, and a forklift stopped sharply and flicked its skid over the edge of the dock. More rust was shaken from the cranes.
Sorry!
And he chuckled heartily to himself.
I never mean to make such an entrance, but I always do!
Bear! Beamed Thomas innocently. You came all this way for us?
They sent the Hymic?
Diesel puzzled, but it wasn't meant as an insult, even though objectively was one.
Of course,
said the bellowing Diesel, in a voice that would have meant anger or panic for anyone else, but was mere small-talk volume for him.
Henry really wanted to come and get you himself, but the Fat Controller couldn't get the permits.
Didn't stop us, snickered Thomas's driver. The fireman landed a punch on her arm.
I told him I'd take good care of you and bring you home safe and sound.
And then he eyed Diesel suspiciously.
I don't believe it.
His voice expressed far more shock than the quiet astonishment he was actually feeling.
So he was right. It was you.
Who was right? Asked Thomas, but Diesel only scowled and gritted his teeth.
It was Duck,
explained the Hymic with gusto.
He even guessed where you were. Said if all else failed, Diesel would make a break for Southampton. We were already headed here when you called.
Thomas and Bear both eyed Diesel, whose face had gone crimson at the very mention of the Great Western Engine.
Blasted Panya. Thinks he knows everything.
When it came to devious Diesel, it appeared that he did. The journey home was awkward. Every mile they traveled filled Diesel with shame. He had failed, utterly. They were carting him back to the very place he had escaped from. He imagined this was how Thomas would feel if he were dragged back to Victoria after receiving his branch line and forced to shunt the yards again. And then it hit him. That's exactly what he had made Thomas do. He had experienced that. Diesel gulped.
How strange, he thought. That was almost empathy just then.
But he didn't drive the budding emotion from his mind, as he'd been trying so hard to do recently. He also didn't explore it further. He simply did nothing, sitting motionless on the rocking flat car, waiting to return to his doom.